right? In about 15 minutes, 20 minutes. You know, the New York Times, the 1619 Project, I'll start with that because right now the president has attacked the 1619 Project. The president is saying he's going to set up a commission to teach more pro-American history. Tom Cotton has attacked the 1619 Project. And what is the 1619 Project? Well, my friend Nicole Hannah-Jones at the New York Times, a brilliant journalist and author and writer, and she recently wrote a cover essay for the Sunday Times about reparations and why now for reparations for slavery. But she conceived the 1619 Project as a project that looked at racial slavery from 1619 in Jamestown, Virginia, when the first Africans who were enslaved initially by the Portuguese and then by the British came to British colonial North America, Jamestown, Virginia. And we usually think about 1619 as the birthplace, the founding of what would become American democracy, the American Republic, starting in 1776. And what the 1619 Project does is a multimedia project with historians, journalists, medical ethicists and scientists and anthropologists, is really look at what was the world that racial slavery created? What was the connection between racial slavery and American capitalism, global capitalism, high finance? How was the exploitation of Black bodies connected to the building of infrastructure, railroads, bridges? What was the cotton trade and the sugar plantations? How is that connected to wealth creation in the United States? Not just in the South, but in the North too. What did racial slavery mean for agriculture, agricultural production? What did it mean for industry? What did it mean for education? What did it mean for textiles and manufacturing? What did it mean for Wall Street? You know, when we think about a state like Rhode Island and Providence plantations, right? So the ports were not just New Orleans, it's not just the Mississippi River, it's also Boston, it's also New York City, right? So what's interesting for us about the 1619 Project is that it really showed the way in which when we think about this country, the United States of America, we are all implicated in racial slavery as the original sin of the country, but really something that created the wealth in the United States. It created American democracy. We live in a racialized, race-based democracy. It creates a racial caste system. Right behind me, I've got Isabel Wilkerson's new bestseller, Caste. And caste is really the superstructure of racism. It's really what she calls the invisible skeleton of racism in this country. And when you think about a racial caste system, it's a hierarchy with whites at the top, blacks at the bottom, and other people of color in between. And they're constantly trying to navigate and mostly pushing towards whiteness because whiteness is connected to a supply chain of power and privilege, in contrast to blackness, which is connected to a supply chain of misery and grief and super exploitation and premature death, both from 1619 to the present. What's important for us about George Floyd is that in the aftermath of the Civil War, 1861 to 1865, where 700,000 Americans died. The best book on this is Drew Gilpin Faust, the former president of Harvard University. Her book, This Republic of Suffering, is the best book on that. And when we think about that Civil War, we were supposed to have solved what people call the race problem, right, in the 20th century. We were supposed to have solved that through the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th Amendment. As Ava DuVernay's brilliant documentary, The 13th, shows, the end of racial slavery really creates a new caste system, with the exception being those who are going to be incarcerated and placed in jail, right? And what the Black Lives Matter movement argued was that the criminal justice system is a gateway to panoramic systems of oppression that are connected to social welfare, public school education and inequality, segregation, residential and in schools, connected to housing for affordability, connected to so many different life chances that are irredeemably corrupted once you are arrested, incarcerated, have a felony conviction, and what the drug war did. But even when we go back to 1865, and there's a great book by Sandy Darity and Kirsten Mullen, From Here to Equality, about reparations for Black Americans in the 21st century. What we see is that even after the end, the formal end of racial slavery and the efforts at Reconstruction and reconstructing interracial democracy, including right here in Texas, what you get is convict lease systems, you get sharecropping, you get peonage, you get black codes and voter suppression, but you get systematic anti-Black violence. It's not just the lynching that Bryan Stevenson's African American Memorial Museum has memorialized, 6,500 people lynched between 1870 and 1950. There's over 50,000 African Americans who are killed and murdered throughout the United States between 1865 and the end of the 19th century. Over 50,000, right? And that includes right here in Texas. And so what we see is that after racial slavery, we get a new caste system that is set up that super exploits Black folks through both the criminal justice system, through warrants and fines and fees. Sometimes we call it Jim Crow, but Jim Crow is about more than just unequal education. It's about more than white and colored drinking fountains. It's about whole-scale racial terror. It's about violence and policies that were there to circumscribe African Americans that are constructed by Democratic politicians and Republican politicians in the late 19th and the early 20th century. So when we fast forward and we get up to the 20th century, and we now all know about Tulsa because the president tried to, or did hold a rally in Tulsa that then Herman Cain died, a maskless rally during a pandemic in Tulsa, Oklahoma. But Tulsa was in 1921 and part of a series of anti-Black racial pogroms that murdered Black people in Atlanta, in St. Louis, in Chicago, in Elaine, Arkansas, in Rosewood, Florida, right? And there were earlier pogroms right here in Texas and Mississippi and South Carolina and Alabama and in Florida, right? It's important for us to understand this. We still have not memorialized those victims. We still haven't. We're in the process of trying to do that, but we still haven't memorialized those victims. So when we think about that first Reconstruction and those efforts to reconstruct American democracy, we often focus on the successes, the historically Black colleges and universities, the churches, the Black elected officials, all men, because the 15th Amendment only allows Black male suffrage for a short time. That Black male suffrage is ended in Texas really by 1870, by 1870, through racial anti-Black violence. White women are going to get the right to vote in 1920, but most Black men and women aren't going to get the right to vote in mass until 1965, August 6, 1965, with the passage of the Voting Rights Act. So we have to understand that even with the civil rights movement's heroic period, and with the first effort at Reconstruction, what we find is thousands of racist policies that are embedded in the infrastructure of our democratic institutions. So Black people are facing structural violence, they're facing physical violence, they're facing racial segregation that makes it easier not only to rob them of resources and deny them of citizenship and dignity, it makes it easier for local law enforcement, which continues to grow throughout the 20th century, but grows exponentially after 1968, to target and occupy them like they are a colony within the United States. So this idea of an internal colony, this idea of a nation within a nation, that's the Black community, and that's what you get with racial segregation. And as the 20th century progresses, you get Black and brown communities who are facing similar circumstances. But when we think about the organizing principle of that caste system, it is anti-Black racism. So there's a difference between anti-Black, anti-Latinx, anti-Indigenous, anti-South Asian, anti-Asian racism. There's a difference. Doesn't mean that people aren't oppressed, but there's a difference, because in this society, in our history, our national shame eternally is that our organizing principle is anti-Black racism. That is our organizing principle in the United States. Now, when we think about the protests that have happened since May 25th, what's important for us to remember is that we had an opportunity in 1963 and 68. In 63, it was opened up through Birmingham, the March on Washington, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., this idea of building a beloved community. And remember, Dr. King argued that the beloved community was one that was going to take work and sacrifice. It was one that was free of racial injustice. It was free of economic impoverishment, and it was free of violence. This is really important to remember. King speaks out against militarism, materialism, and racism very eloquently and increasingly with more radical and bold tones as the 1960s progresses. We often don't want to remember the radical and the revolutionary King because that King makes us all uncomfortable because he has a critique against predatory capitalism. He has a critique against anti-Black violence. He has a critique of what we call food insecurity, but it's more than food insecurity. It's the exploitation of the poor when 37 million Americans every day don't know where their next meal is coming from in the world's richest nation, right? And King says all this. After Dr. King's assassination, over 100 cities are going to erupt in urban rebellion, political rebellion. Bobby Kennedy is going to run really this glorious 82-day campaign for president where he promises a multicultural, multiracial democracy that is going to be free of racial violence and segregation and recriminations. He's going to be assassinated on June 5th, 1968 in California. And really in the aftermath of those two assassinations, we're going to have a chance to pick the beloved community, but we're all going to embrace law and order. And Richard Nixon's law and order, George Wallace gets 13 million votes as well. George Wallace is an open white supremacist, an open racial segregationist. So before this current president, we had Wallace and Nixon. And what's important for us is that over the last 52 years, both Democratic and Republican politicians have invested in the world's largest criminal justice system that has been designed to immiserate and punish and incarcerate and demonize and denigrate and dehumanize Black people in this country, especially poor Black people. So when Malcolm X said in 63, after the Kennedy assassination, chickens have come home to roost, he got pilloried because people thought he was excited about the president's assassination. He wasn't. What he meant by chickens coming home to roost was that the United States could not be the biggest, what Dr. King would later call the biggest purveyor of violence in the world, and not expect that violence to come and boomerang back on itself domestically. So when we think about 2020, this is a year of political and racial and economic and moral and health reckoning based on these decisions that we've made. And we have to own up to our own culpability in those decisions, right? Before this moment, we would have never had an honest conversation about investing in Black communities and communities of color, investing in more non-lethal first responders. Sometimes people are saying defund the police. They really mean reimagine public safety. They don't mean the literal defunding of the police. They mean money for homelessness and ending that, money for healthcare, including mental health care. They mean non-lethal first responders, especially in some of the most poorest and traumatized communities that we have right here in East Austin as well. That's what they mean, right? And so moving forward, what's been so impressive about this moment is the millions of people who've actually organized, who are trying to read about anti-racism, trying to read about Black history, trying to read about Black and Indigenous and people of color history. The way in which Black women have really been leading. When you think about Black feminism and this idea of intersectional justice is very, very important. We usually think about Angela Davis and Ella Baker and Ida B. Wells, Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth, Lorraine Hansberry, all these different Black women who talked about Fran Beal, who talked about race, class, gender, sexuality, Audre Lorde, who's the Black lesbian poet and author. And now we've got Tamika Mallory, and we've got Patrice Kahn Cullors, and we've got Alicia Garza and Opal Tometi and Brittany Packnett and No Name, the hip hop artist. And they've been extraordinary because they're talking about both intersectional identity and intersectional issues. The COVID-19 pandemic has shown us that this pandemic affected all of us, but differently. Some of us are able to Zoom and keep our employment. Some of us who are billionaires have actually made many more billions during the COVID-19 pandemic. Over 170,000 of us in the United States have died. So many Black and brown children cannot Zoom in. So many Black and Latino children and people have died because they're facing disproportionate underlying conditions. My brother's an ER doctor and talks to me about the way in which so many Black and brown folks have underlying conditions, from diabetes to asthma to tension and stress and high blood pressure. It's extraordinary. So COVID-19 is killing the least of these in our nation at a disproportionate rate. And so really, for those of us who are interested in social justice, who are interested in Dr. King's idea of building a beloved community, we do have this generational opportunity to build that beloved community, to do what James Baldwin described as finally achieving our country. But the only way we can do that is by speaking truth to power. And that goes beyond bromides, that goes beyond compromise platforms from any political power. That goes way beyond that. So what we're in our Jeremiah moment. We're in, when you think about, and people in this country don't read the Bible anymore. They don't, because many people don't know where my name Peniel comes from. And a cursory reading of Genesis gives you Peniel. All right, just a cursory reading of Genesis. Most people don't know where Peniel comes from. Amias is from the Old Testament too, and Joseph as well. And Peniel, by the way, is where Jacob fought the angel, wrestled with the angel all night, and he called the place Peniel, and it means, for I've seen the face of God, yet still live. And the reason why the Bible is important for us, whether you believe in it as just a story and a metaphor, or you really believe it, that all of it happened, is that it provides us a context. It provides us a context to think about good versus evil. How do we treat each other? How do we think about morality, not in the cheap morality of who's sleeping with whom, but in the morality of, do we want children to be hungry at night? Why do so many Black kids have asthma and are subject to lead poisoning and unclean water in the United States of America? How come COVID-19 has hugely high rates on Native American reservations in the United States? How come those who are disproportionately unemployed during this crisis are people of color, and those who can't Zoom in to work are people of color, right? Democrats have a real role to play here, but they're going to have to be courageous. And we have to remember, especially since the Reagan Revolution, the Democratic Party has not had a great history of courage, okay? And I'll say it again, especially since the Reagan Revolution, the Democratic Party has not had a great history of courage. Instead of embracing the beloved community, Democrats too often embraced neoliberalism, trickle-down economics, top-down economic theories that said that if the rich did really well, that money would trickle down to the poor. That did not happen. Instead, we have the biggest inequality between the rich and the poor in American history, even bigger than the Gilded Age of the Rockefellers and the Vanderbilts and the Mellons and the Carnegies, right? So we have to speak truth to power, and we have to center racial justice. My friend Ibram Kendi talks about anti-racism and how can we build an anti-racist future. The Democratic Party has to think about what Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was talking about in the late 1960s, a poor people's campaign that was going to build not just a great society, but a good society, okay? The Poor People's Campaign was designed to guarantee a universal basic income for all Americans that included healthcare. Dr. King talked about food justice, and in Marks, Mississippi in 1968, Dr. King was in tears when he was surrounded by poor Black people, including children who couldn't afford shoes for their feet. And he said that the way they were living in Marks, Mississippi, the poorest zip code in the United States, was a crime. This is King, not Malcolm X. Malcolm X said that Black people had been the victims of crimes as well, but this is Martin Luther King Jr. This is really important for us because what King asked us all to do was to reject militarism, materialism, and racism. King said that it would be a bitter but beautiful struggle, but now was the time to make real the promise of American democracy. So 2020 is another watershed moment. We have a moment right here where there's this massive pandemic. We see a massive wealth gap. We see massive problems within our criminal justice system. We've got environmental disasters all around us, and anti-Black racism and white supremacy are at the core of these issues and the core of these problems. And too often, neither political party has been able to face these problems. We have one that is building up a new confederacy and a new white nationalist, ethno-nationalist state overtly, right? But the other is not, instead of courageously speaking truth to power and embracing the best parts of American democracy, those parts that Black people have actually always believed in, the other instead is speaking in milquetoast language and not really embracing this moment because they're scared and they're timid. So it's really up to all of us. The highest calling of any American is citizenship, right? And so for those people who've been marching and protesting and saying, I can't breathe, we see Vanity Fair has Breonna Taylor on the cover, but none of this is enough. Branding Black Lives Matter and making it another commodity within the context of our neoliberal state is not enough. We actually have to mean what we say and walk the talk. And that's going to mean not necessarily receiving standing ovations when you're talking about massive redistribution of wealth and justice in the United States. That's what we need. And we need it right here in Texas. We need it in Austin. And we have to center the least of these if we're going to get that. And when we think about, and I'll close with this, when we think about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., his last speech was April 3rd, 1968. And what he says in that speech, because he's in Memphis helping 1,100 sanitation workers who are on strike. And what he says in that speech, there's an injunction that's saying that they can't march the next day. King, for the first time, says that he doesn't care what the court says. He's not going to let any illegal or immoral injunction stop them from organizing and marching the next day. This is Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who had always said, hey, I got to wait for the courts. I'm waiting on the courts. I gotta wait for President Lyndon Johnson. I just need some help. I got to wait. By 68, he's saying he's not going to wait. Never, ever talking about violence. King is going to go to Washington and do an Occupy Washington movement. He's not bringing guns or knives or a curse word. Everybody from the New York Times to the Wall Street Journal is saying King is going to foment violence. Why were they so scared? They were so scared because of his moral force. He actually believed in small d American democracy. And what he says in that speech, that I may not get there with you speech, he says we have some difficult days ahead, but he says the greatness of America lies in the right to protest for right. King believed in the founding documents more than the founders, more than the presidents and the elected officials of the 1960s or now, because he believed that small d democracy could actually rescue not just the United States, but the entire world. So this idea that love is what justice looks like in public is what Dr. King meant by building the beloved community. We can do that in our own time. We can do that in Austin. We can do that in Texas. But unless we are all actually committed to taking that higher moral ground and taking that stance where we're going to say that racial justice is the core of who we are. It's at the core of building a new consensus, a new American consensus that finally takes us away from our tragic racial history. Until we do that, we're going to keep repeating these cycles of violence, these cycles of recrimination, these cycles of inequality, and really these cycles of willful ignorance where we're all wondering, how in the world did we get here? Thank you.
My goodness, Dr. Joseph, I don't know about everybody else, but I've been mesmerized by you as long as you've been speaking, soaking up every word that you've been saying. Thank you so much. Some words that really stand out to me are that you reiterated: truth to power. And you called out both parties for not, particularly Democrats, for sometimes not having the courage to be outspoken in the face of tyranny. I personally, my question is, can you expand on that? how have Democrats been guilty of lacking the courage to stand toe to toe with the racism and tyranny of people like Donald Trump and really some of the legacy of the Republican Party?
Yeah, Debbie, I think criminal justice is a great example where, Democrats were racing towards the death penalty, racing towards 3 strikes and you're out, racing towards the war on drugs, testing in our schools, especially our poor schools, not understanding that the way in which you were going to transform public school education was through equal resources, but also desegregation, right? Not supporting racially integrated gentrification. Gentrification is great in terms of investment if we allow indigenous people and their children to stay and go to school with white investors and white families, right? So the Democratic Party, unfortunately, has too often really reneged on that promise of multiracial, interracial democracy. And I think even President Obama in 2020, it was a very sobering speech he gave at this year's Democratic National Convention, which was online because of the pandemic. And what a turnaround from 16 years ago when he talked about no blue America and no red America. He gave a speech saying that we were on the precipice of losing our republic, losing our democracy, right? So the Democratic Party, at times when we should have been the party of universal health care and Medicare for all, the Green New Deal, a party that is against domestic violence for all women, but is centering the fact that Black women are disproportionately victims of that and disproportionately victims of sexual assault, disproportionately have the worst maternal health outcomes, disproportionately are sexually trafficked, has not supported those communities, even as those communities have really voted for them, especially Black women, at over 90%. You think about Doug Jones in Alabama, 97% of Black women voted for him in that special election, right? And when you look at our Congress and our state ledge, even the Democratic Party, when you look at the supply chain of Democrats, not just elected officials, but who are their staffers? Who do they hire? Who do they connect to? Who are their lawyers? All of us have a supply chain, Debbie, that we can connect to either power or privilege or misery and grief, right? And the Democratic Party, which obviously the party's realigned in the 1960s. So the contemporary Democratic Party, we are the party of Lincoln and Frederick Douglass and anti-slavery. That's who we are. Just like the contemporary Republican Party is the party of the Dixiecrats and the Democrats and pro-slavery. That's who they are. It's just that the party's realigned in the 1960s. But considering that we are the party of Lincoln now and the party of Frederick Douglass, the party of Ida B. Wells, who just won a posthumous Pulitzer for her anti-slavery, her anti-lynching journalism. It's been extraordinarily disappointing when we don't really extol the virtues of racial justice and how racial justice should be connected to our domestic and foreign policy in a very, very robust way. And that when we do that, we all win. That's the whole thing, that when we do that, we all win. And again, we had examples, in the past. We've had people like the Jesse Jacksons, we've had the Maxine Waters, we've had different folks who are very, very strong. And even really, there's aspects of LBJ's legacy that are very, very strong in terms of racial justice. But too often we've really dropped the ball and we've let our forebearers bear the brunt, right? And say, well, back in the day, we were really strong. And now we don't want to appear weak on crime. We don't want to appear weak on defense. And in doing so, we capitulated and we've moved the discourse away from building a new consensus into constantly being on the defensive, right? And even now, in the age of BLM, obviously, the polling was never going to be the plus 25 for BLM that you saw in June, and now that's all gone. But you still should be defending Black lives and saying, what can we do to end thousands of racist policies and institutionalize anti-racist policies?
Yes, sir. And I think that sometimes it's a bitter pill to swallow. It's not good enough to just say we are not like Trump. That's not going to work. We have to stand on our own right and our own merit. Thank you so much. We have a question. We'll take definitely several questions because we have so many people interested in speaking with you. I hope that you have a few moments for us this evening.
Yes, I turn into a pumpkin at 8 o'clock. to be with the
My
family.
goodness. Okay. Okay. So our former president, Hazel Weathers, has a question for you.
Yes, first of all, thank you so much for this presentation, this information, the history that means so much in helping people to understand the issues that we face. But I wonder if people are asking themselves, what can they do as individuals to help move us toward the beloved community, or to end racism, or to put pressure on those in power? What can
Well, we
we
could,
do?
yeah, no, Hazel, that's a great question. We can do a lot. I mean, I've given Debbie a bunch of anti-racist resources and really ways WOW and your supply chain can support the Center for the Study of Race and Democracy, but also Austin Justice Coalition, Grassroots Leadership, Texas Appleseed. There's so many different organizations right here locally. So that's one. I mean, support, support, support. Notley Tide is supporting 5 different racial anti-racist organizations right here in Austin. We're proud to be one of them, but people can support, support, support. The other is there's multiple things. One, people, you know, there's a reason, Hazel, there are books like How to Be an Anti-Racist that have sold 1 million copies the last 5 months. White Privilege by Robin DiAngelo, Mia White Supremacy by Layla Saad. There's many different choices and options. There's some books for young adults too, Stamped by Jason Reynolds, which is a remix of Ibram Kendi's National Book Award winning Stamp from the Beginning. A book about anti-racism for young adults is great. So there's so many different ways that you can educate yourself. In local communities, especially Austin is so racially segregated, most of us are going to be living in either predominantly white or predominantly Black or Latinx communities. Really, there's not a lot of mixed race. I live in Hyde Park, which is hugely racially segregated. I'm one of the few African Americans here in Hyde Park, and places like Tarrytown and others are even worse. Let alone, yeah, there's so part of what people have to do is that where they're at, there's going to be ways that whether it's through their local PTA, their church, their synagogue, their neighborhood organization, that they can leverage their networks to become, one, educated about anti-racism, but then to become players in building an anti-racist future. And that includes, when we think about Code Next and building codes and more density, we've got to be for that. Certainly it's got to be smart and environmentally sensitive, but we want, like on 45th Street in Duval, I'm fine with people building more because you get a more racially integrated, economically integrated community. You can't have the suburbs just writ large everywhere, where everybody just has big houses and nobody who can't afford $700,000, $800,000 homes and then $15,000, $20,000 a year in property taxes can live among you. You're never going to get any diversity. So you have to think about the building codes, the residential codes. You've got to speak out. It's city council, but really our small communities, we know through whatever member clubs we're part of, social groups, civic groups, fraternities, sororities, we have networks and we can leverage those networks. So it's up to everyone to leverage those networks on behalf of centering racial justice right here. And that includes your public and your private networks. So I know WOW, and just even looking before I did this and Hazel, that there's you know, women of color connected to WOW who are part of the founders, and you've thought about that in a purposeful way, right? And so people have to do that, where you're, you know, Hazel, you're not the only Black woman connected to WOW, you know, and so you're not integrated if you just have one or two, and you know this, right? So we all have to be enormously purposeful in terms of thinking about Black dignity and citizenship right here in Austin, and really moving beyond diversity, equity, and inclusion, because the original sin is racial slavery. And if we're thinking about acknowledgement, repair, compensation, reparations, both morally and politically, we have to say, well, where there's 7.8% Black folks in Travis County, we have to say, where are they at the C-suite here? Where are they in the board of trustees? Where are they as small businesses? Where are they at UT in nonprofits, but also for-profits? Where are they in our public schools? Where are they in terms of getting accepted to the University of Texas? we have disproportionate Black males at UT playing football and basketball, but not as undergraduates and graduate students, right? And so there's a problem there, and we have to admit the problem if we're going to effectively confront it.
Thank you. We're going to do our part to pump out all the information we have that you can provide to us about links to videos or book list or anything like that through our newsletter and other sources. Now, I see a really interesting question from Catherine in the chat. Catherine, why don't you go ahead?
Well, you know, Elizabeth Warren brought this up in her campaign on reparations, and I'm very curious, what are your thoughts on a workable solution for reparations?
Well, I think there's multiple. I think the best book is, or one of the, Derek Hamilton, who's a friend, is an economist, has along with Ice Cube, the rapper, a contract with Black America, contract for Black America that has a reparations about a bank, zero interest loans, so many different things through finance and capital that can be done. The Black economists, William Darity at Duke, and his wife, Krista Mullen, have written a book, From Here to Equality, that I just finished teaching in my graduate seminar over the past month, which makes an argument of $12 to $14 trillion in reparations over a 10-year period that would be given to Black families. That would be approximately $800,000 per Black family, which would end the wealth gap between Blacks and whites. That would be 90% of the wealth that white families have. Their framework is that the Black family would have to have one member who could prove that their lineage goes back to racial slavery. And that's their framework. Other people don't have that framing. So I think that you do need direct compensation to end the wealth gap that is connected to not having 40 acres and a mule, and land expropriation that was taken away from African Americans. Black people are on 2.4 million acres. 100 years ago, they had 15 million acres of land. There's also reparations for Black people not having access to the GI Bill when they should have after the Second World War, not having access to Federal Housing Authority, the FHA 30-year low interest mortgages. Great book here is The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein. Also, When Affirmative Action Was White by Ira Katz-Nelson, and also Race for Profit by Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor. Hugely important here because a home that cost $50,000 in 1950, 50 years later, was worth over $450,000 by 2000. The generational wealth that was built by what Tom Brokaw calls the greatest generation, African Americans did not get a chance to participate in that in a meaningful way, and that provides another really deficit in terms of building generational wealth. So this is more than just income. Another part of reparations is going to be at the local and the state level. Okay, at the local and the state level, and that's connected to small businesses. It's connected to the fact that one of the things the city of Austin should be forever ashamed of, not just the 1928 racial segregation plan, but as soon as the city started gentrifying, they should have ended property taxes on Black and Latinx East Austin residents and given them zero interest loans to refurbish their homes so they could be part of the new gentrifying Austin. The city did not do that, okay? So these are things, one of the things that when you think about where we live right here in Austin and both in the United States, the way in which we've treated Black people is morally reprehensible and politically indefensible. What you're hoping is that somehow it's redeemable, that it's not irredeemable, that you can do something. But it goes beyond just some kind of public apology, although I'm all for a public apology. It goes beyond just anti-racist policies, although I'm for anti-racist policies. What you have to do is provide a context for the wealth, not just income and not just education, although I'm all for income and education, but it's the wealth that was expropriated and continues to be expropriated, because right now, Black bodies still are connected to supply chain of white wealth, including our Black athletes, especially our Black athletes connected to colleges and universities, because everyone knows the Ponzi scheme that the NCAA has been revealed during a pandemic where the Big Ten and all of us at UT were playing games because they are professionals and the school is getting money, and the school didn't care whether these kids lived or died. All the schools, the Big Ten is starting up October 24th. So we all of us who are people of goodwill and good conscience, we have to say that, look, this is politically indefensible and morally reprehensible. They're not students, they're workers. During a pandemic, you're saying they have to play. They're workers because you're getting a paycheck. The school, right? Millions, and people, the NCAA is getting billions for every game they play. That's why Nebraska, everybody, and you know who's coming to play? It's Black kids because they play the best. You're getting the Black kids. It's these Black boys. And so you don't care if they're students, right? And so part of it is what we're seeing in terms of this idea of reparations. Sometimes people are like, well, what do you mean? I had nothing to do with it. Well, you had everything to do with it, and you have everything to do with it now, because even poor whites are treated by institutions in American democracy and American society different than their Black counterparts. And we know that. We've got the data and the outcomes for sentencing, for life chances, for healthcare. Everything is treated differently, right? So the only reason they're treated differently is that they're coming in to a nation that is forged under that crucible of racial slavery, Jim Crow, segregation, lynching, racial pogroms, right? And each generation just further reinforces that caste system. So that means even Eastern European immigrants from failed totalitarian states who are white can be first lady and can be treated better than Black people who've been here for generations and helped build the country. That's why you have to pay. And with that, I'm out, people. Family time. Take care, everybody.